Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds on global trade policy, specifically these big new tariffs and, the ripple effects they're causing everywhere. We've got quite the stack of sources here, recent stuff from the Times of India, BBC, Al Jazeera, plus some pretty detailed economic analyses we've been looking at.
Yeah, and our mission today really is to unpack what's going on with President Trump's latest tariffs. We want to look at who's actually being targeted, maybe figure out the why behind it all, and critically, what are the real-world economic consequences going to be? Especially, for you listening.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The immediate hit is, well, it's pretty significant. President Trump's put new import duties on, over 90 countries? Effective August 7th, 2025. And it's not just one single rate, right? It's like a tiered thing.
Exactly. It's crucial to get how these are structured. You've got a baseline, a 10% levy on almost everything coming in. That's invoked under emergency powers, Section 232, basically saying imports threaten national security. But then on top of that, you have these country-specific reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah.
And those can shoot up to 50%. They're aimed squarely at countries the U.S. feels have trade imbalances or, aren't playing fair reciprocally.
And the scale of this is, wow. It pushes the average U.S. tariff rate higher than it's been in nearly 100 years.
Yeah.
The administration says it's about, shrinking the trade deficit, bringing manufacturing back home, protecting national security, and tackling what they see as unfair stuff like currency manipulation.
Right. If you zoom out, what you're really seeing is this major push to reshape the whole global trading system. The thinking is that the current system has been, unfair to the U.S. It's not hitting everyone the same way, though. Some big economies, UK, Japan, South Korea, they managed to negotiate lower rates. But others, like Switzerland, they couldn't get a deal done, and now they're facing pretty high tariffs, like 39%.
Okay, so this brings us to India. This looks like a particularly high-stakes situation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent even called India a bit recalcitrant in the trade talks. That's pretty pointed language for a partner.
It is, and it makes you ask, why single out India like this? I mean, they're generally seen as a key strategic partner.
Right.
Well, the official reason is it's a direct penalty for India buying Russian oil. The White House is framing that as an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. India's response, though, is firm. They say it's about market factors, and it's absolutely essential for their energy security. We're talking 1.4 billion people.
And the numbers really show how serious this is. An extra 25% tariff on Indian imports. That brings the total up to a huge 50%, kicking in August 27th. So India becomes the most heavily taxed U.S. trading partner in Asia, basically tied with Brazil and India's External Affairs Ministry. They immediately called it unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. They're vowing to protect their interests, and they've already hit back with their own 25% tariff on U.S. goods starting August 7th.
Yeah, the economic hit for India could be massive. Almost all of their exports to the U.S., that's about $86.5 billion a year, could just become, commercially unviable. Most exporters there just can't eat a 50% cost increase. One brokerage firm literally described it as being like a trade embargo. And remember, the U.S. is India's top export market. Even just a 25% tariff could shave maybe 0.2 to 0.4% off India's GDP. That risks pulling their growth below 6% this year. Things like textiles, gems, jewelry, those labor-intensive sectors, they're going to feel it hard. Although electronics and pharma seem to be exempt for now.
So what does this mean for actually talking? President Trump's basically said trade talks are off until this tariff fight is settled.
Right. And India is looking at its options. Urjit Patel, the former central bank governor, he said India's worst fears have come true. The big question for Modi's government is, do they back away from Russia to get rid of this Russia penalty, or do they hold their ground? Dr. Kirich Bajpai thinks maybe India offers some concessions, kind of in line with their general foreign policy direction, like reducing reliance on Russian military gear. But then you have Ajay Srivastava arguing the opposite. He thinks this might actually push India closer to Russia and China, maybe even revive those trilateral talks when Modi goes to China for the SEO summit soon, SEO being the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
And it's important to remember, isn't it, that the U.S.-India trade talks were already stuck before all this, mostly because the U.S. wanted more access to India's farming and dairy sectors, which are really sensitive politically in India, and they just weren't budging.
Absolutely. And this whole thing, it also puts a damper on India's rising status as a China plus one spot, where companies try to diversify away from just relying on China. India was benefiting from that. These tariffs could definitely slow that momentum down, although maybe investor confidence holds up if key areas like semiconductors stay okay, because that's where a lot of investment is heading. And retaliation from India. Well, it seems unlikely they'd go all out, but it's not impossible. We saw them put tariffs on U.S. apples and almonds back in 2019, though those were later rolled back. Rahul Gandhi from the opposition Congress Party just called it economic blackmail. Strong words there, too.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. Let's talk semiconductors, because this is where it gets really, really interesting for, like, global tech supply chains.
Yeah, this is pretty dramatic. President Trump's rhetoric has really ramped up here. He's saying tariffs on semiconductors could land within weeks. And the numbers he's throwing around are, well, astonishing. 200% to 300%. That's a massive jump from the 100% that was talked about earlier.
And the reason for this huge threat, it seems pretty straightforwardly aggressive protectionism, right? Just trying to force semiconductor production back onto U.S. soil. It feels less about trade balance and more about strategic control.
Definitely. It's a strategic push. And it raises the question, are there any ways around these tariffs if you're a company? Well, Trump has hinted that companies actually building or expanding chip factories in the U.S. might get an exemption, which fits perfectly with things like the CHPS Act, that big government push with funding and tax breaks to get semiconductor R&D and manufacturing happening domestically.
The market reacted pretty quickly. Most chip stocks took a hit, the PHLX semiconductor index down about 2.3%. But, and this is interesting, Intel's stock actually jumped, up nearly 6%. Apparently, there were reports about possible government investment or maybe even taking a stake in Intel to help their U.S. manufacturing push.
Yeah, connecting the dots there. These kinds of tariffs would make imported chips incredibly expensive. So companies would basically be forced to rethink their entire global supply chain strategy. And Intel, especially if it gets government backing, could end up being a major winner in this whole reshuffle.
So, okay, all these different tariffs, different sectors, but at the end of the day, who's actually paying for all this?
Well, the U.S. government will certainly collect a lot of revenue. The estimates are huge, like $4.5 to $5.2 trillion over 10 years. But the actual financial burden, that falls mainly on U.S. companies importing the goods. And ultimately, that gets passed down to you, the consumer. Tariffs basically act like taxes on imports. So the cost of goods, the cost of materials to make things, it just goes up.
And we're seeing signs of this in the data already, right? Wholesale inflation jumped in July, fastest pace in about 3 years, I think. And people's expectations about future inflation are rising too, up to 4.9% for the year ahead. Consumer sentiment has also taken a hit recently.
That's right. And economic models, like the one from the Penn-Wharton budget model, they paint a pretty grim long-term picture if these tariffs stick. They project potentially a 6% drop in GDP over the long run, a 5% fall in wages, and for an average middle-income household, something like a $22,000 loss over their lifetime. The key insight from that kind of analysis is that tariffs are often seen as more damaging than just raising taxes by the same amount, because they mess with supply chains, they reduce competition, and that really drags down output and wages more severely. Oh, and related to this, the Commerce Department also just expanded those 50% steel and aluminum tariffs to cover hundreds of related products, effective August 18th.
It's weird, though. Despite all these worries, U.S. stock markets actually hit all-time highs this week. How does that square with the long-term economic warnings? Is it just the market being short-sighted, or is there some kind of adaptation happening?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It highlights this tension. The stock market can reflect confidence in specific sectors, maybe companies perceived as winners from the tariffs, like Intel perhaps, or just a general belief in short-term adaptability. But the economic models are looking at the bigger, longer-term structural impacts across the whole economy. So the real question is, how sustainable is this market optimism if these deep structural changes really take hold? On the negotiation front, things are still moving too. The U.S. and China, for instance, they extended their tariff truce for another 90 days. So those big trade talks are pushed back to November. Tariffs on Chinese goods are still averaging around 55%. And negotiations with Canada and Mexico are also still very much active points.
And there's one more wrinkle. These tariffs are being challenged in court, right? Multiple lawsuits in federal courts. So an appeals court could theoretically step in at any time and either uphold them or strike them down. Adds a whole layer of uncertainty.
A huge layer of uncertainty, yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it's definitely a complex picture, a global trade landscape that's, changing rapidly. We've seen President Trump using tariffs very strategically targeting specific countries like India for geopolitical reasons, like the Russian oil issue, and targeting key industries like semiconductors, really pushing for domestic economic goals, specifically reshoring production.
And we've really tried to highlight the ripple effects, the significant economic consequences for businesses, yes, but also directly for consumers, and also the potential for some pretty big shifts in global alliances as countries react and figure out where they stand in this new landscape.
So given this whole complex dance, the economic costs, the political pressures, this strategic realignment, the thought we want to leave you with is this. How might these really sweeping tariffs ultimately reshape the global supply chains and trade relationships we've known? And maybe more personally, what kind of lasting impact will that have on your everyday choices and maybe even the cost of the things you rely on every day?